As you can tell, the meeting is being recorded, therefore we have officially begun, although I will drag my feet for a moment or two as the room continues to populate. I know there's a few people still joining us here as I can see the number going up. And while you wait, here's our weekly poll question. What types of civic engagement are you currently involved in? Take a second and respond to that. Question number 2, what number of civic groups are you involved in? We'll let you define that however you see fit. Fantasy football does not count.
Well, if you're part of the voluntary management structure, that would be different, I think, right?
Absolutely, if that's right. All right, I think looks like we're probably ready to get going here. I know a couple of people will be popping in a little bit late. Thank you for everyone for joining us for our penultimate session of the virtual Burke to Buckley program this summer. The topic is mediating structures, which I think is timely. We've touched on it a little bit in some of the previous sessions, and I know we will again next week too. It always elicits some interesting thoughts and commentary from everyone in the group, so I'm looking forward to that tonight. I'm going to skip too many housekeeping announcements tonight and just remind everyone in the interest of time tonight that if you may have a question or comment, to try to make it relatively brief, just so we can make sure everyone has a chance to say what they want. Last week, I think we had to cut off 1 or 2 people at the end just because we ran out of time. So no long monologues, a few seconds to make your question or comment or respond to somebody else's point, and then we'll continue to move on. So with that being said, I'm looking forward to introducing our discussion leader for the evening, William Schambra. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? I'm in a new setting and I want to make sure. Okay, very good. Our discussion leader for tonight, William Schambra. Bill Schambra is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Prior to joining Hudson as director of the Institute's, he was director of the Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal in January of 2003. He was director of programs at my hometown Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. Before joining Bradley in 1992, Bill Schambra served as senior advisor and chief speechwriter for Attorney General Ed Meese, director of personnel management Constance Horner, and secretary of Health and Human Services Louis Sullivan. He was also director of social policy programs for the American Enterprise Institute and co-director of AEI's A Decade of Study of the Constitution. From 1984 to 1990, Schambra served as a member of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, to which he was appointed by President Reagan. From 2003 to 2006, he served on the boards of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service. Bill Schambra has written extensively on the Constitution, the theory and practice of civic revitalization and civil society in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Policy Review, Christian Science Monitor, Nonprofit Quarterly, Philanthropy, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. He's edited several books, including As Far as the Republican Principles Will Admit, the collected essays of Martin Diamond. The Nonprofit Times named Bill Schambra among its 2013 Power and Influence Top 50, lauding him for consistently sticking his finger, quote, in the sector's elite and raising questions designed to broaden the idea of philanthropy's role in America today. So with that, I think he's a perfect person to lead our discussion this evening on mediating structures. Bill, I will turn the floor over to you to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And let me say it's an honor and privilege to be here with you all this evening. I think our impromptu survey as you were entering the Zoom session this evening confirms what social scientists tell us about the state of mediating structures today, namely that among better educated professionals such as yourselves, they're alive and well. They may have helped you find your current job. They'll certainly help you in future advancement. They may have helped you meet your partner. They will help you raise your children, not only by keeping them busy, but by teaching them critical moral values. They provide emotional and material support in times of crisis. They provide a sense of moral and spiritual purpose for you and surround you with others who share that view. In short, they're really essential. I think you know that they're essential for helping you become who you are and defining your place in the world. It's almost impossible to do that as radically isolated individuals. And yet, as the social scientists also tell us, far too many Americans today are in fact radically isolated without the social capital that you possess and your organizational attachments. Ever since Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone appeared in 2001, scholars have deluged us with grim statistics demonstrating that mediating structures are in decline, that Americans are increasingly detaching themselves from families, neighborhoods, houses of worship, and voluntary associations of all sorts. And more recently, Charles Murray in Coming Apart and Tim Carney in Alienated America have helped us see that it's not all of us, it's rather chiefly low-income Americans, urban and rural alike, who lack that network, increasingly divorced or never married, not attached to any voluntary association, and most problematic of all, no longer affiliated with the house of worship. As a result, they're increasingly alienated from society. Their lives are disorganized with no immediate social structure available to help them put their lives back together again. An additional bit of bad news is that the trends that have contributed to the collapse of mediating structures are not abating. And here I have in mind not so much the economic or technological factors as the fact of American progressivism. Since the beginning of the 20th century, progressivism has been profoundly hostile to mediating structures because it is rooted in a geometric vision. The goal of progressivism is to reorganize society into a rational, coherent, scientific order. The most important decisions therein will be made by trained professional elites who are thoroughly steeped in the natural and social sciences. But everyday human beings tend to get in the way. They tend to draw their opinions instead from all sorts of antiquated, partial, parochial institutions like churches and families, in short, mediating structures. And so those institutions in the progressive vision must be weakened, especially through the pulverizing and atomizing effect of radical individualism. Mediating structures are seen as oppressive and stultifying to the free individual. After they're dismantled, society can be reorganized around that unified, rational order preferred by our elites. One final bit of bad news, conservatism for most of the 20th century had found ways to defend mediating structures. In writings produced by people like Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, Peter Berger, and Richard John Newhouse, whom you read for this evening, mediating structures had some outstanding intellectual champions. They in turn helped persuade conservative political leaders of the centrality of those structures to a healthy society. Beginning with Ronald Reagan, our leaders actually made a determined effort to work mediating structures into their political designs. Reagan did it in his rhetoric about a return to the human scale and in something called the private sector initiatives effort. George H.W. Bush, of course, exemplified this in his 1,000 Points of Light idea. George W. Bush, in his devotion to the importance of community and faith-based initiatives. However, all of these initiatives worked out in practice, they at least demonstrated that it was possible, and maybe even necessary, for conservative politics to champion this notion of mediating structures. I think the bit of bad news is that our leading national politicians today seem to have forgotten how to speak that language. So what in light of all of this can be the good news? I think ironically, it can be found in some of the most pessimistic accounts of the fate of mediating structures. Scholars from Robert Nisbet in the 50s to Patrick Deneen today have pointed out that those structures have been opposed and attacked not just for the past 100 years by American progressivism, but indeed since the rise of modernity itself with the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. That is, they've been attacked since the 1650s. The project since then has been to replace irrational, antiquated, chaotic, oppressive cultural institutions with a rationally ordered geometric arrangement of atomistic individuals under a unifying elite vision. That's been hammering away at community institutions for almost 4 centuries. That includes, incidentally, the period that Robert Putnam described as the sort of peak of associational life in America in the 50s and 60s. So I think it's important to put our pessimism about the collapse of community into perspective. If after 4 centuries of sustained hostility from our intellectual leadership, it's still possible to find community anywhere at all, I think it's pretty amazing. But I think you can go say more than that. A growing number of thinkers today have returned to the notion that mediating structures are indeed essential to the future of the nation. No matter how grim their assessments of the present, they admit that there's no other way forward. If you've read any of these authors, you've seen that theme. Writers like Charles Murray again, Yuval Levin, Patrick Deneen, Rod Dreher, Tim Carney, Ryan Streeter, Andy Smerrick, David Brooks. The final bit of good news, I think, goes beyond any sort of intellectual struggle to the very heart of what it means to be human. Robert Nisbet insisted, and this is a quote, insisted that the quest for community will not be denied, for it springs from some of the powerful needs of human nature. Needs for a clear sense of cultural purpose, membership, status, and continuity. In other words, the search for community, for immediate face-to-face relationships with and support from human beings is built into human nature. Just when you think modernity has finally pulverized community, it springs up again. I've been privileged to see this firsthand for the past 40 years or so in my association with Robert Woodson, who's one of the 6 conservative African Americans. And he was also at AEI when Berger and Newhouse wrote To Empower People. And as I've followed him and listened to him, he tells us that in the most desolate, bleak, atomized neighborhoods of America, there are to be found traces of community, and he finds them and helps nourish them. As he argues, low-income people in the worst of circumstances, long after government and the free market have failed them, are nonetheless able to come up with their own solutions to their problems, whether it's in a storefront church or a boxing club or a 12-step group. They gather in community to meet their needs according to their own values. They are living evidence that the quest for community will indeed not be denied. Ironically, even though conservatives have such a poor track record among low-income people, we're better equipped, I think, by our predisposition toward mediating structures to respond to this impulse that Bob Woodson describes, to recognize, acknowledge, and support these local efforts in low-income communities to build proud, self-sustaining neighborhoods. You might be familiar with Woodson's work as a founder of the 1776 Project, which is designed to counter the New York Times' 1619 Project. As he maintains, the argument of 1619 completely erases the long and noble history of Black mediated structures in American history. Churches, private schools and colleges, fraternal organizations, by suggesting that no progress is possible in an America dominated by structural racism. So on balance, I think I find myself somewhat hopeful about the future of mediating structures, both as a pillar of conservative thought and as an essential character of American civil society. But let's see what you have to say about mediating structures. So let's see those hands.
So let's go. Who wants to be first? Let's hear your responses to the readings tonight. I would also like to really try to make sure, as much as possible, the conversation stays relevant to what everyone read, so we're all coming from the same point of view. The first hand I see here is Robert in Pearl River. So let's go with you, Robert. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I found the readings fascinating. But what's throwing me off is the word mediating. And that's what threw me off. Because we think of mediators. For example, there may be labor mediators or diplomats mediating between countries or in the Civil War. So I got lost, and I was thinking, what can be a better term? And I was thinking of intermediate, but I don't know what the better term is. Why mediating when it seems to be a process of intervention between the government and, let's just say, grassroots people?
Chris, do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead. You could respond to that, and if anyone else wants to chime in, that's fine too.
Yeah, I will.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise that question, because it is troubling in a way. I mean, we're talking about civic associations that are in some respect independent organizations in their own right, and the term mediating structures kind of reduces them to a buffer zone. I think that's what's troubling. Nisbet, incidentally, describes them as intermediate associations. So he gets, I think, more to what you're saying. I think for Berger and Newhouse, you have to frame the discussion this way. They were, when this was written in the mid-70s, as far as they were concerned, the welfare state was here to stay. It was pretty much never going to go away. And yet, as the reading suggests, people were increasingly alienated from the megastructures of society, from the big institutions of society. So if you could find a way to basically deliver the welfare state, through mediating structures, through these intermediate associations, you would not only preserve the welfare state, but you would also be delivering services through institutions that have credibility with the people, right? To whom people feel a sense of belonging, and in that sense, they are meant to mediate between the state and the individual. I think over time, I think Berger and Newhouse themselves came to think that really these institutions are more than just adjuncts of the welfare society. That in fact they are as I say, powerful independent organizations in their own right. And they warned us, incidentally, about the dangers of mediating structures being captured by government, right? And we have that problem today, right? I mean, an awful lot of government services are delivered through nonprofit organizations. And the purpose of that is to indeed to try to keep providing services at the same time that you are doing this through institutions that have some connection to the daily life of people. And yet there is this problem of capture, right? I mean, the fatal embrace, or something, I can't remember exactly the term they use, but there is in fact, they recognized that there was this difficulty. So I think you're right to be troubled. In short, I think you're right to be troubled by that description, by that term. And I think they themselves might have selected otherwise had you asked them this same question 20 years later.
Mr. Kolke in Sacramento.
There we go. All right, so I've got 3 points to make. One is that I agree with the literature that associations serve as a check and constraint of government, and therefore are an important part of a Republican form of democracy. I also agree that in some cases, government has taken over some of the functions of associations, and that is a problem. I'd say in particular, government's taken over some of the functions of the family in terms of an economic unit that sustains its members by providing welfare with respect to each child and so on. And so I think that in some ways, the welfare state has undermined the family and thus in that way captured in part some of these private associations that serve as a check. But I'd also say that I see a downside to the associations insofar as they can capture the government. And a good example is California. I mean, the California government is largely captured by the public employee unions and by the environmental associations. And at least for the past some 11 years, California government has not swayed from the position that the public employee unions and the environmental associations take, whether it's higher taxes to provide for the pensions and pay for the public employees, or it's the quest for addressing and somehow arresting climate change to prohibiting someone from being an independent contractor. And so, I mean, I agree with the readings. I agree about the importance of mediating associations in terms of a Republican form of government. But I don't know if I've got a solution to the abuses where they basically capture government.
Bill, I'll let you respond if you'd like, and then Richard, you'll be in the queue.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Some nonprofit organizations, you've named some of them, are so big, right, and so massively organized and funded for various political causes that I find it difficult to even describe them any longer as mediating structures or as civic associations as we understand them, I think, in this Zoom broadcast. Nonprofits become so unmanageable that they really are indistinguishable from government. They're organized like government. I mean, they take on all the trappings of government. The situation you've described in California, of course, is true also in New York City. I mean, the politics of the city is, nonprofit organizations have been the stepping stones for the political leadership of New York City for many years, and then those same nonprofits become, basically political adjuncts of the politicians that they gave birth to. So, I think that just being private or just being non-government isn't what we're talking about here when we're talking about civil society or mediating structures. I think we're really talking about associations at the grassroots. I think that is the beating heart of democracy. The fact that everyday people, and again, I go to Bob Woodson's work, these are folks that he works with who have been betrayed by, not only government, but every big nonprofit in town, right? These are folks that, the Boys and Girls Club down the street is an alien structure for them, right? But the storefront church is not an alien structure. And I think that's what we're really talking about here as the essence of the kinds of organizations we're describing. Is that helpful at all? I mean, I don't.
Yes, I think that, helps better define and perhaps narrow the description of mediating organizations. But of course, I see it also as kind of a slippery slope, which I think you do as well.
Oh, sure, yeah. There's no question. I mean, and of course, some of the every one of these huge Goliath organizations engaged in urban politics or in the politics of the state of California, almost all of them started out at some point as some scrappy little, storefront nonprofit. And they did such a terrific job. They ended up, collecting all sorts of resources and supporters. And ultimately they became corrupt, right? I mean, these are human institutions, right? And they have all the foibles of human nature, which is to say that, as we accumulate power and wealth, we tend to become, corrupted by it. But there's always, I think the message of mediating structures is it's always possible for us to go and start our own new organization as an alternative to those corrupt structures. And I think you see that all the time. Again, it's not, people think that impulse is missing, but it's not, it really isn't.
And I agree that the ability to create a new association, a new mediating association as a check on those who have abused their power is probably the silver lining and the strength of the underlying concept of mediating associations.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Richard.
Yeah, the spirit of it is as important as any particular manifestation of it in an institution. The fact that and incidentally, you saw this, if I can, I don't mean to ramble on, but you saw this in our the past year and with COVID and so forth. People, obviously some of the established mediating structures of society were shut down, right, by government. Churches were, less able to function than they had been before, and so forth. Other voluntary associations, but people discovered that their neighbors weren't able to shop, or that their neighbors were getting inaccurate information about they organized, right? I mean, an awful lot of mutual aid was going on in American neighborhoods to make sure that the folks who were really up against it in this COVID crisis were sustained in some way, that they were provided with groceries, that they were checked up, that they were regularly looked in upon by someone who had their welfare in mind. So Americans once again, rallied to that cause. The problem with it is that at that level, right, it's almost impossible to see. It's almost impossible to count. It's easy to figure out how much money the Red Cross has collected or how many members it has. It's not so easy to keep track of all of that neighborhood activity going on beneath the radar. But I think that's the glory of, as I say, of American mediating structures.
Richard, in Texas.
Yeah, I wanted to point out something that I found really neat about, especially the Tocqueville portion of the readings. He talked in a really ingenious way about there's the American art of association as opposed to what he called the French reliance on government and the British reliance on men of rank, the aristocrats, and of how to accomplish these different ends. And from my world, I'm one of the 33 conservatives in the performing arts left in the US. I'm a member of a couple of nonprofits that are, music teacher associations, symphony orchestras, that sort of thing. And a lot of our history coming in from Europe is very different because, of course, for centuries we relied on patronage from men of rank, aristocrats, people that were the bishop that had the orchestra in his, church for mass and that sort of thing. And it's very interesting to me that there's this disconnect in our associations and in the arts, which are overwhelmingly left-leaning, but still rely overwhelmingly on community support from people around them. You know, they talk a lot about wanting more government funding, wanting more grant funding from the NEA, different things, but the vast majority of their funding still comes from people buying tickets to the concerts and fairly well-to-do donors and corporations in their communities around them who know them personally. And it's kind of this extension of a neighborhood, which I find really quite exciting. It's one of the neatest things about being involved in these associations. And I don't have very many, political conversations at this point with my colleagues, but it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition between this sort of default mode, I think. I don't know if it's education or what we're sort of steeped in this idea of, oh, let's just go to the government and look for something and let's get more funding from that. Even though in practice, it's actually quite free market-ish and quite conservative in some ways in terms of how these associations are funded and how they're kept alive and how they're nurtured from the people. But I thought that was a brilliant remark from Tocqueville, because it cleared up a lot of things in my head, kind of going back in my own experience from studying the history of musical associations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, very good observation.
Ben.
I really enjoyed these readings. Last time I was thinking in response to one of Jeff's comments, I got to send Jeff some de Tocqueville. And here we have it, megastructures, right? A bunch of the things that were coming up in our conversation last time. But couple of comments in response. Robert, I mean, I like the term civil society. In some ways, maybe it's more general, but it sort of represents the blooming, buzzing confusion of other organizations aside from government. Of course, it doesn't necessarily screen out the other megastructures, which, these days clearly include things like Google, Apple, Amazon, right? And, probably Walmart, right? A lot of these big businesses as well. But it certainly suggests this is something that has a life of its own. It's not remotely mainly a matter of just mediating between individuals and government. This is where people live, and government hopefully just sort of tries to maintain some of the boundaries and create a context in which the rich life of civil society can thrive. And I think it's intrinsically, there's a pluralistic cast to it. But I'm not sure exactly if that phrase is usually used in the way I'm thinking of. In other contexts, I'd be interested to hear is it Bill? William? Yes.
Yeah, our distinguished speaker.
Our distinguished speakers.
Yeah, that's good.
Thoughts on that? Let me make a comment on Dan's point. I think the main solution to your concern might be, at least one really important solution is suggested by some of our earlier readings, somewhat by Jeff's comment in the chat, more associations. When particular associations have disproportionate power, one of our first places to look to solve that problem is to cultivate more associations, more power centers that can compete and moderate and limit the excesses of, in terms of the logic of, right, this concern was brought up under the heading of factions earlier. The bigger the democracy, the more pluralistic in some ways, that the better prepared we are to prevent any one group from gaining disproportionate power. But in an environment where the conditions are not conducive to sustaining these associations, it's really easy for a few of them to get extra big and extra powerful and just kind of take over. So I think we have to think carefully about the conditions, the social and economic and policy conditions that are making it hard for us to sustain associations. But I think maybe that's good for now. our distinguished speaker may have some thoughts.
Yeah, I just saw the chat messages here, so I haven't had a chance to read them yet, but I gather part of the question is about factions, the difference between mediating structures or mediating institutions and factions. And I think, Jeff, if I'm reading this correctly, and I'm not a Zoom professional, you're saying that the faction is political and mediating institutions are non-political, and that's exactly right. I think that's very true. Although the function, it should be noted that the function, I mean, the founders obviously were concerned about the dangers of faction, but at the same time, they didn't think you could do anything about it. And in fact, they figured out they had a way of using, right, the multiplicity of interests to solve the problem of factions by, there would be such a great diversity of interests in the country that majority factions wouldn't form as readily around some unified political goal that was inimical to the interests of minorities. And I think the same thing works in civil society and civic associations, right? I mean, the proliferation of civic associations is such that it does make it difficult for grand oppressive schemes to form within civil society. So that I think there is that resemblance, but you're absolutely right that factions are in the political world, and mediating institutions are part of a sort of a broader social universe. What else was, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, would it also be fair to say that factions are often competing for political power, as where associations maybe rarely are? I mean, I'm not concerned about the Humane Society fighting for power from the Catholic Church, or they have their own reason for existing, is where I think the faction conversation was more of a fixed pie struggle.
Yeah, I think that, well, part of the problem in civil society today is that an awful lot of our civic associations are becoming political and are activists, basically, right? I mean, if you look at they may claim to be charities, they certainly take the 501c3, tax privilege and so forth, but really they're all about politics, and we know that to be true. And there's a handful of us who are trying to beat back that huge wave. But part of the difficulty here, and those of you who have tried to raise funds can attest to this, an awful lot of the people of wealth today in America have very pronounced left-wing notions of what America should be, and of what nonprofits should be doing in America. So I am struggling in my own writing nowadays to try to carve out and protect this independent realm of civil society, relatively free of huge ideological crusades that get them off track. I'd much rather see them devoted to local needs, immediate needs, the kinds of things that we typically associate with charity, right? I think that there's still a role for that. And, we run a real danger when we politicize those institutions and devote them to larger ideological causes.
And go right to the lobbying line item of their budget, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Right.
Blake, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Let me turn my volume here. So looking at this topic from the international sphere, specifically American military interventions, it appears states which had a history of civil structures like Germany and Italy performed better after military intervention, whereas countries like Libya and Afghanistan, which did not have such a history, have largely been failed states. So my question's three parts. do you think mediating structures can prevent a political situation like foreign invasions? Let's say the situation in Libya or Afghanistan. Do you see a connection between post-invasion state failure and a lack of mediating structures? And do you think the US should support the growth of foreign mediating structures to stop state failure?
It's a very modest question, and I'll be able to answer that in about 30 seconds. You know, it's interesting. I was just reading in the Washington Post today a piece about what's happening in Afghanistan. Of course, deeply depressing, but in the midst of it, there is a story about the reconfiguration of civic militia groups, right, in the parts of Afghanistan that are largely being abandoned by the Afghan National Army. You know, the government is withdrawing into its sheltered enclaves. And, you know, people are saying, well, we're not crazy about the government, but we're certainly not crazy about the Taliban. We remember what the Taliban was like. So, you know, we're going to have to organize ourselves once again, you know. So it may very well be that the only thing left standing against the Taliban after our assistance is ended will be, right, civic associations carrying guns. Right? This is, and of course, this was the state of affairs in Afghanistan, you know, before we arrived. Right, there were parts of Afghanistan that were able to resist Taliban incursions for years because of their powerful civic association. So we may end up there again. It's a mixed bag. We tend to always want to create a modern state. You know, there are people, and Nisbet incidentally is one of them. Nisbet believed that the Shah fell in Iran because he was trying to build a modern state in a nation that wasn't ready for it, that was still very much divided into traditional religious and cultural associations of all sorts. And he destroyed them, or he tried to destroy them. And the backlash against that modernization effort was what brought him down. And Nisbet would, argued, and students of Nisbet who were studying international relations argued that, there are limits to state modernization. You cannot do that in certain parts of the world. And I think that I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think that American foreign policy has notoriously not taken mediating structures in other countries into account. And we've constructed some pretty catastrophic foreign policy because of that.
I call it a sufficient answer. We're going to go to Helen and then Nick. We haven't heard from either of you yet tonight.
Hi, good evening. I was just going to comment about the international piece. Bill, our distinguished speaker actually said a lot of what I wanted to say is, my observation as an immigrant, I think in many of those countries, they actually do have strong, small scale civil institutions, like on a village level or in a neighborhood or through the religious institute, like the mosques, the congregation. What it really lack is, to me, for civil institution, the mediating institution to work, to be really effective, it's a complement element of a functioning society. A functioning society need to have a rule of law, need to have a transparency, need to have a strong, legal system, need to have a clear governance system. I think the reason why, Americans' foreign intervention failed so many times in the foreign country is, in those countries, use Afghan as an example, that it within its own tribe, there is a strong civic mediation institute to take care of its own people, but it's also have long history of tribal conflicts that has been going on for thousands, if not hundreds of years. Those things cannot be dissolved, immediately. That's one thing. Another thing is, in those countries, it lacks of the rule of law. It lacks of a clear, transparent governing institution or structure to begin with. So, and those things takes a long time to build. As our distinguished speaker said, American intervention tend to actually, its focus on military intervention actually fail to rely on those institutions that the civil institute, mediating institution already exist, and also fail to recognize the deep division and the conflict between the tribal, history go back to 1,000 years. We want a solution in a few months. Instead, we get stuck for 10 years because those things hasn't been resolved for hundreds of thousands of years. So we really lack of realistic view. But to me, as an immigrant, one thing, when I first moved to America, I was so impressed by there are so many churches. I never seen, of course, I came from China, it's atheist, but I never seen so many churches around the street corner. And I walked into many of them. Anyone I walked into, people were so nice. They're so welcoming. It's just, it's a really good feeling. I think that we have a very strong mediating institution. Just most of them are not on Twitter, so it's depressing. If you go on Twitter, you think everything's falling apart. But if you actually go into your neighborhood, if you go to your local churches or mosques or some other institutions, you actually feel there are strong bonds, in a small scale. It just Twitter is not a reality of what's going on in America. My last point is I think that I think some mediating institution, the reason they grow so big, like the Planned Parenthood or the teachers union, is because the government is also growing big. So it's like two beasts mutually feeding each other, right? Those organizations, they want to rely on a bigger government to, for example, Planned Parenthood, they're supposed to be a non-governmental, non-political group, but they receive fundings from the government. So they grow politically powerful, then the politicians want their votes. So they mutually feeding each other through their power. Then they use their power to destroy some other institution, for example, like the religious group institutions. And we see that happen, especially last year, when churches are not allowed to open, but you can open bars and the restaurants, things like that. So that's my comment.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think as the American foreign, our elites have contempt for mediating structures domestically and internationally, right? I mean, it's no accident that when we go abroad with our notion of democracy, it's going to be a strong centralized state. It has to be a modern bureaucratic administration of rules and regulations. It has to disempower traditional organizations and institutions. That's always been the way we've done things, right? And it's had terrible consequences. One of the President Jim of South Vietnam, of course, his American advisors said, build a modern state, construct this powerful central state in Vietnam. And so he set out, one of the first things he set out to do was to suppress the religious cults in South Vietnam, even though, right, they were well armed and they controlled substantial portions of the country and kept the communists out and suppressed the Viet Cong, right? So, Jim ends up fighting these religious factions that could have helped him out, that could have in fact been allies, but they resisted the modern state, the American idea of a centralized state. So they had to go. And again, that's the way we try to do things. That's what we tried to do it in Afghanistan. Right? And it's not going to work. We know that now. And mediating structures of some sort or another are going to have to pick up the slack.
Nick. Ronald from Chicago.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think Helen's comment about beasts feeding each other is a fantastic one, and it's relevant and raises the question of what is the real purpose of the trillions that are being spent, that have been proposed and that are now being spent. I mean, if I don't think anyone really knows what it all adds up to, but it's certainly in the trillions, probably in the 5 trillions. And it's called a COVID-19 fiscal response, or by various other names, but what is its true purpose? And I think, to Helen's point, part of its effect is to co-opt mediating structures, and to, I mean, who can compete with a favored organization getting 10, 100 billion? I mean, your local church can't compete with that. So I think to bring this home to what is going on around us right now is part of what's going on with this gargantuan spending is it's killing competing structures, including the mediating structures that are the subject of our discussion this evening.
You know, I think they certainly endanger those institutions, but I think that this is just the latest chapter, right, in an effort to subvert, overwhelm, co-opt, buy off mediating structures. It's been going on for a very long time. And, Great Society was this huge attempt to, flood private sector associations, nonprofit organizations of all sorts with federal dollars, right? And nonprofit organizations became critical service delivery vehicles for Great Society programs. And a lot of those associations became, are now, nothing but adjuncts of government. But I do think that underneath that, there is still this nascent capacity to organize alternative mediating structures and mobilize civic energies around that. Let me give you an example, if I may. People, when we talk about civic associations around schools, people think, well, PTA, right? Of course, PTA is well, the PTA was founded by a couple of very wealthy women in Washington at the beginning of the 20th century, basically to convey the message of the elites about education to parents, right? To re-educate parents into the ways of true education, which is to say progressive principles, right? And advanced notions of what the country should be. That was the PTA's original purpose. It wasn't captured. It was designed to do that. And people, beginning in the 90s, people began to realize that, the PTA is nothing but a creature of the teachers union. Basically, there's no way on earth your local PTA is ever going to defy what the local teachers union wants. And so they began to organize alternative parent groups, parent teacher organizations, PTOs, other sorts of groups that were genuine expressions of parental opinion. To say nothing, of course, of school choice, right? People began to simply pull their children out of public schools altogether and select private schools, which are absolutely essential, right? Essential mediating structures to educate their children as alternatives to these huge public institutions. So I think you're right that this trillions of dollars are certainly going to be up to no good, but I don't think it's a new story. I think we've been fighting this battle for over 100 years at this point.
If just a
Johnny
quick
B.
comment, what frightens me is just the scale. This is in constant dollars, 50% bigger than the New Deal. It's 8 times larger than the Marshall Plan and so forth. It's just
Right. No, it's enormous, no question about it.
Johnny.
Yes, sir. I wanted to go back to your comments about the deterioration in the mediating institutions. I think we have a very positive example of how they can be restored. After the Civil War, the Black family was really weak due to slavery. But what happened is the Black church stepped in, and over the next few decades, did a masterful job without money and federal funding, restored the Black family, made it strong. It remained strong till the 1960s. It was only after segregation that it declined. And that was essential for pushing back against the state-sponsored violation of their civil liberties through segregation. And another quick additional point to that is, I think we've truly come to the point we're no longer talking about modernity, but we've moved into post-modernity, which I think further stresses the issue that to restore the institutions in our culture, the conservative movement can no longer just speak in modernity terms. We have to go back to the first principles of the Western tradition, and that can answer the challenge of postmodern nihilism, and particularly invoke those first principles like all mankind is made in the image of God, with the sense of the heroic, which our culture has lost, which also means we have to go into Hollywood and tell the tales of the heroic to help recapture public's imagination in a positive fashion.
Well, let me just say to your first point, you echo Bob Woodson's argument when you talk about the Black church. As I say, that the untold story of African American history is this powerful influence of mediating structures, right? From not after the Civil War, but going in, before the Civil War, right? African Americans were already forming civic associations of all sorts: the Prince Hall Masons, the so-called Black Elks, a number of fraternal orders, in addition to, of course, the churches. More recently, right, since beginning in 1905, you had the rise of Pentecostalism, which gave rise in low-income communities, Black and white alike, to a whole host of very healthy religious institutions among low-income people. Pentecostalism is extraordinary. It began in 1905, right? A Black minister by the name of William Seymour had a revival in Los Angeles, the Azusa Street Church, and the Azusa Street revival, at this point has swept the world and includes hundreds of millions of participants, right? And it's invisible, right? I mean, people don't know about Pentecostalism. Our elites have no idea. As far as they're concerned, it's all snake handlers and speaking in tongues and so forth. I mean, they dismiss it completely, and yet it's this massive movement that swept the world in just over 100 years, right? It's extraordinary. So there are an awful lot of these activities that go on that either the elites don't see, or they regard with such contempt that they just don't give them credit for what they're able to do. And in the African American community, that's certainly the case, right? That they have never failed to work out their own fate through those kinds of institutions. And it's inconvenient for us to talk about it, right? Whites typically don't understand that history and don't care. We conservatives haven't done a good job of paying attention to it. And of course, it's very inconvenient for today's left-wing narrative about what America is, right? I mean, it would say that that's impossible. You can't have these powerful Black institutions constructing their own lives because, it's a white supremacist society, and agency on the part of minorities is impossible in this oppressive atmosphere. So anyway, thank you for introducing that idea.
All right, this-
Amen, amen, amen.
These calls always go quickly, but believe it or not, we're already past the hour mark. So I'm gonna try to go quickly. Ben, I see your hand up. All due respect, I'm pushing you down just so we can get to people we haven't heard from yet, which will be Mitchell next, and then Robert in Yellowstone.
Thanks for a really fascinating discussion. The thing about Pentecostalism is really interesting. A couple of points. First off, I wonder to what extent Madison's factions versus de Tocqueville's meeting institutions are a function of when the two were observing the American scene. Madison kind of looking at the broad scope of history, de Tocqueville looking at what was happening in an entrepreneurial Jacksonian America before the solidification of these institutions that became increasingly statist over time. And then second of all, an example of this process is higher education, which is something I've studied, I've published on, and done a number of studies of the politicization of higher education. And if you look at the process of how these mediating institutions has been corrupted, I would say that the early to mid 20th century, that with the advent of progressivism and the New Deal, saw a huge sea change. And I have to also add that foundations played a role in increasing the degree of leftwardness and statism. But in particular, this guy, Christopher Loss, wrote this really fascinating book about how higher education institutions were politicized by the New Deal, and in particular that Roosevelt, and I think this occurred with the media as well, which you could also view as a kind of mediating institution that's gone awry, that the Roosevelt administration consciously co-opted fields like agricultural economics and turned them into propagandizing vehicles for his administration. And this in turn, as everyone knows at this point, like the universities have become so politicized that they're almost like a wing of the Democratic Party. Just today, there's been a huge controversy at CUNY, where I work, where the faculty union, which is itself like, you call it a mediating institution right out of the Communist Manifesto, came out in favor of like the Palestinian cause, and a number of faculty are resigning. And it's so politicized, there's like not much left other than the politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. Higher education, the modern research university was the child of the progressive movement, right? I mean, before you had the modern research university, you had small sectarian colleges by and large. 4 years, was the top level of education. The colleges were associated with various religions. The president of the college would give the capstone senior seminar on ethics, and of course God would figure centrally in the course on ethics. And the modern foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Russell Sage, all set out to undo that, right? And to found these massive research universities that would produce a new elite, right? A new secular elite, steeped in the sciences, natural and social sciences. And they would go forth into the world and be the new sources of culture in America. So that, again, that's something that goes back to the early 1900s, beginning with the Johns Hopkins and University of Chicago, of course, on and on. All of these places. It's no accident that they're cutting edge left-wing organizations today, institutions. That's sort of what they were designed to be. Now, the character of progressivism has changed, right, quite a bit since then. But it was at the time very technocratic and, again, scientifically based and oriented toward the rule of elites. And the left claims to be very different today. But higher education was always a part of this grand progressive project. And the foundations, were not only there at the beginning of this nefarious undertaking, they're of course really there today, right? I mean, you have quite literally billions, and in just the past year, you have had something like $1.5 billion devoted by the leading foundations to the sort of farthest left politically active nonprofits in the country. So it's, there's no question that universities, foundations, they're all part of this problem of elites. Fortunately, again, because it's America, when we get fed up, when we're disgusted enough, we can form our own institutions as alternatives to that, right? I mean, there are still colleges in America, that teach a very traditional kind of understanding of America and based in an understanding of God, right? So, and Lord knows the government's been coming after them, right, for years, right? I mean, the Bob Jones University decision was part of that effort to dismantle, Christian colleges, but we haven't gotten to the point where we can't fight back.
Robert in Yellowstone, are you there? Hands up, but I don't see you. Yep, there you go.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I was hoping to segue over to the article about subsidiarity and solidarity by Christopher Wolfe. It seems to me that there's a lot of wisdom in it, worthy of considerable discussion. And I'd never ever heard of it. So I'd be really interested in our distinguished speaker's critique of its strengths and potentially weaknesses.
Why don't you tell me, because I'm going to stall for time, why don't you tell me for a second just what it is exactly that you found most useful about it? Because
well, I guess it was
these were the recommended, not required readings. I read them probably 3 years ago, and I just don't recall, what that argument was. I remember thinking that these were really good articles, but to be honest, no one has ever raised the issue of the recommended reading. So I'm really happy you did, but you're going to have to tell me what it is that you found particularly interesting.
Well, okay, I'm hardly qualified to do that, but I guess to try to summarize, I would say it's the tension between the subsidiarity and the solidarity, in that one talks about the essential need for free citizens to consider the overarching common good, as at the same time that in the subsidiarity you're attempting to counteract, or it does counteract the concern that we came up earlier tonight, which is about the excessive individualism and isolationism. And I don't know that I can summarize much more than that, but I found that both the answer to where Pius XI, the Pope, comes out and said essentially that they're opposed to all forms of socialism, and at the same time being opposed to this, excessive libertarianism. Do those ring any bells?
Well, subsidiarity is certainly whenever we talk about mediating structures, the notion of subsidiary is subsidiary institutions comes up, because that that is in fact a powerful piece of the Catholic tradition, and it's the notion of national solidarity, is at least in my take on it, and I think in Robert Nisbet's take on it as well. It's the progressive movement that has been determined to kind of forge a sense of national oneness, right? I mean, Jonah Goldberg describes all the devices in liberal fascism. He describes all the devices by which progressivism has tried to unify the country as if it were one big national family. The device of the moral equivalent of war, right? Johnson, LBJ declared war on poverty because, of course, the notion of war would unify the country as one in this effort to overcome in poverty. Jimmy Carter had war on the energy problem as part of his malaise speech in 1979 or whatever it was. So, the project of building national solidarity has been largely one on the left. And I think it has all sorts of dangers. Now there is, of course, among Catholic thinkers today, there's a new emphasis on national unity, right? I mean, the number of Catholic thinkers have begun to raise that issue as well, within the context of Catholic teaching and within the context of conservatism. I'm a little leery of it, to be perfectly honest, because I don't think we have a chance of winning that battle. I think we have a chance of preserving islands of traditional values and conservative, the conservative way of life. I don't know that we have to withdraw completely to Benedictine communities the way Rod Dreher suggests, but I think that we have a chance of preserving these pockets, and by our good example, beginning to make converts. But the notion that we can somehow, aspire to a national vision based on these values, our values, I think is very tricky and isn't likely to work, and is in fact likely to sort of confirm the most unfavorable impressions that people have of the conservative movement. It makes us, we've always been accused of being theocrats, right? They were trying to establish a theocracy. When I was working at the Bradley Foundation, it was our ultimate goal was to establish a theocracy. Ridiculous, it was just absolutely ridiculous. But nonetheless, we have to avoid actions that give the appearance of that sort of thing.
On the topic of that particular article that Robert mentioned, is there anybody else that wants to chime in with their questions or thoughts on that particular reading?
Yeah, who's read it, unlike our distinguished speaker who apparently didn't do it?
Don't bother about raising your hands if there's something on this particular article or reading you want to contribute. Just unmute yourself and chime in.
Hi, this is Jeff in Cleveland.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, just a real quick statement that as far as the principle, I did drop a link in the chat, by the way, to the American Solidarity Party. Not that I'm a member or am, a proponent of the party, but if you're interested in understanding how subsidiarity is being more or less embraced and re-articulated in a more contemporary context, you may want to check out that particular political party site. The second thing I will say is that, fundamentally, Dr. Schambra just talked about the notion of, achieving national unity. I think the only way that's ever going to happen is by the totalitarian bent of the current left, right? Because really from that end of the spectrum, it's fundamentally opposed to the principle of subsidiarity. In other words, it believes that any and all opposition to its ideological position is inherently evil and therefore has to be eradicated. Basically, the analogy that I use working in the biopharmaceutical industry is that you cannot manufacture high quality drugs and pharmaceuticals in an environment that has microbial incursions. You have to have a complete sterile environment. And the political left looks at alternative ideologies in much of the same light. So the only way you would ever be able to achieve some sort of national unity, some kind of national solidarity, is by completely eradicating any and all opposing viewpoints. And of course, we know that's untenable or unsustainable. That's one of the reasons why we need to be able to counter that through a variety of different strategies. So that's really all I would have to say on the notion of subsidiarity and its importance to the current moment.
This is Robert again. I think it's interesting that the segue or getting into the political end of, commonly known as solidarity, that's not what I got from this article at all. This was entirely different and was, completely opposed to socialist kinds of activity. And so I guess maybe I need to reread it, but I thought there was a lot more in terms of principles there.
No, I clearly need to reread it. So I think you've probably done a very good job of describing it. But as I say, having not read it recently, I really couldn't say. And I'm really sorry about that. I apologize.
Are there any, we're almost at the 10-minute mark, believe it or not. So I'm curious if there's any other particular passages from any of the readings that struck you all that you'd like to kind of bring to the group or bring to Dr. Schambra for his commentary, anything in particular from the readings. And at 5-2, I'll give Dr. Schambra the last word. If seeing none, I think I'll go to Beth and then James. Is that okay with you, Ben? Okay, Beth and James. Beth, I think you may still be muted. I'm not getting sound from you. From the top. Is anybody hearing Beth?
No.
No. Okay. James, we're going to go to you, and then Beth will try to come back to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I guess just sort of a reflection on a number of sort of the observations here around concentration of influence and power, I guess, and maybe it just comes down to human nature, whether looking at it from the conservative view or progressive view or faith-based view or corporate view. I mean, I think a challenge or conundrum that I wrestle with and think about here is, I guess, human nature, and that is that organizations get to a certain scale, self-interest comes into play, regardless of what your philosophy or view is. You become too big and with too much power or what have you. And I guess I'm not sure what the answer to that is. Humans are humans, and sort of how you mitigate that. There are governmental and other steps taken. For example, if you look in a corporate context of monopolies and oligopolies from a business perspective. So, but I think you can sort of think about that concentration of power. There's an economic dimension, but from a thought, philosophy, values perspective as well. So I don't know that I'm looking for an answer. I'm sort of, I guess, making an observation and, interested in what others might think in terms of perspective on that.
Anybody want to respond to that, or Dr. Schambra?
I would just say to that again, and I hate to keep repeating it, but when organizations become so large and unresponsive, alternatives spring up. as either as offshoots of that big oppressive organization or as upstart, radical outliers that end up challenging the central power. I mean, we've seen it again and again, and just the history of the church in England and America. You have the Church of England was, itself, of course, born of rebellion, but it became unresponsive to the developing middle class in England, and John Wesley and the Methodist faction ended up breaking away and establishing its own church, and then William Booth ended up complaining about the fact that the Methodist Church was too stodgy and it wasn't reaching the man in the street. It wasn't reaching the person in the street. It wasn't out in the highways and byways preaching to the working class. And so he established the Salvation Army, right? So you have this sort of progression of breakaway organizations. And as long as you have free society, which of course you get in England and in America, and then it comes to America, of course, Salvation Army, and then there's an offshoot, volunteers of America and so forth. You have this process of schism and division within the church, which obviously the establishment church is really unhappy about. Nonetheless, it's the glory of a free society that when you become fed up with, this stultifying methods of the establishment church, you start your own, right?
Beth, do you want to try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. So I had been sitting here thinking the whole time about these mediating structures and wondered about just your local political organizations. I accidentally got involved in my local Republican Party precinct, kind of got volunteered and was not seeing that coming. But I had also been thinking since the last election that I should get more locally involved. So I found that so encouraging, meeting people on the local level, of course, in the same party, just to find that affinity with one another. And it's made me wonder too about how we're organized to manage all of these local and national elections. I feel like that's a great mediating structure that we're able to participate in to have an impact in this country on a local and a national level. And I was also really surprised and kind of encouraged by the last conclusion section in the reading by Christopher Wolfe on just the mention of Tocqueville. It says it resists a certain democrat. He says this view encourages citizens to be active members of the community. It resists a certain democratic tendency noted by Tocqueville for the individual to withdraw into a small circle of family and friends, neglecting participation in the life of the political community, and thus making it easier for government to fall into unfit hands. So I don't know. It's kind of a comment and also kind of a question, like, do these political parties and the way we're organized and the way we do this year by year by year, is that a mediating structure? And then I was just encouraged by that comment too, that we can have a positive impact, hopefully, in the long run. I think I'm finished.
Yeah, I think Tocqueville, there were political associations which were very important, but as he says, even more important than political associations were these voluntary groups that you're talking about, and as you suggest, the importance of those groups for Tocqueville, they were important because without them, democratic individuals would indeed tend to become super isolated and fragmented. I mean, that's what we're seeing today, in parts of America, that kind of fragmentation, the withdrawal into, our own very enclosed personal space. And he understood associations as absolutely central to the way you convert those atomistic individuals into engaged citizens, right? And more often than not, it is, in fact, you sort of back into it. You get drafted into it by your neighbor. They say, come along to a meeting, or, I've got to do this, stuff these envelopes. Can you help me out? Whatever it is, right? The people are drawn out of their isolation into these kinds of associations. And at the local level, often it's hard to distinguish between, social associations and political associations. They're very closely related. And, that's the way it should be. I think that's exactly the way it should be. I think, incidentally, you're going to find out of this, the unhappiness around critical race theory. I think you're going to see a lot of local mobilization, not just by Republicans, but by parents who are, absolutely furious about the way, our elites have imported these doctrines, and suddenly they appear in schools. And as threatening as that is, and as dangerous as that is for civil society, I think it gives parents a real chance, a real opportunity now to become politically active and to become civically engaged in ways that they hadn't been before. So I think that's actually a very positive aspect. In the 90s, a lot, at the beginning of the Newt Gingrich revolution that ended up, with Republican control of Congress for the first time in 40 years or something. That was born around a lot of parental dissatisfaction with various teachings that were then being infiltrated into schools. So I think it's what you've described is a very positive development, not just for you personally, but I think it's, I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, we were able to hear from a immigrant from India that's gotten involved as well. And of course, she's talking to people in her community too. And there's still people that just say, there are still people, of course, that still say, oh, why should I bother? They're going to win. They're going to still stand strong. Why should I even bother to vote? Those kinds of things are out there. That kind of thinking is still a big challenge.
Yeah, sure. Right. So do we have anyone? Have we lost our moderator?
I think he did cue you after 8:25 to give us any closing thoughts. So if you have some, maybe,
Okay. Yeah. I really think I've pretty much said what I had to say about this. And to return to my opening comments, one of the things we did at the Bradley Foundation before the fall of the Iron Curtain was to fund nascent civic groups behind the Iron Curtain, but in the former Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc countries. When I despair about the fate of civil society in America, I look at what we were able to do behind the Iron Curtain and with those countries that had been under totalitarian rule right since the Bolshevik Revolution, through several generations, not just it was if they were going to construct the new socialist man that didn't need civil society, that didn't need God, they had plenty of time to do it, right? And they failed to do it. And absolutely key to the triumph in the Cold War, as you know, beginning in Poland and in other countries, Czechoslovakia. You know, private civic associations, often, you know, bitterly opposed by the regime. Those private civic associations were absolutely central to dismantling the, you know, the Cold, to overcoming the Soviet influence in Europe. So as, you know, a final optimistic note, I leave you with that thought, that, you know, that they didn't suppress, they didn't manage to destroy civil society. And in fact, you could say, and this is certainly the history of Christianity, you know, the more they tried to suppress it, the more it spread. And I wonder if that isn't going to happen here in the United States as well. The more they try to suppress it, the more it spreads. You know, the more determined we become to organize our lives in these smaller civic associations where our values will be permitted to prevail.
Sorry, I dropped out there all. Looks like you carried on just fine by yourselves. Thank you. And hopefully you didn't already address this. I did have one final question for you, and you can just sum it up in a sentence or two, if you will. Why is this session, mediating structures, important to the syllabus and to this program?
I think mediating structures are where we're born into mediating structures. Unlike a lot of the doctrines and tenets of the conservative structure of beliefs, you know, you have to be talked into a lot of that. You have to be talked into libertarianism. You have to be talked into a belief in the marketplace. I mean, mediating structures, on the other hand, you're born into them. You become aware over time that they have been absolutely essential to shaping your life, to giving you the values that have made you who you are. In that sense, they're deeply traditional organizations. They're steeped in religious faith. They carry all the values of conservatism that you've been talking about, I think, probably for the past several weeks. But it isn't often that we actually consider them individually as a set of institutions. That's something that conservatives don't do enough. So I think that's why it was good. I hope it was useful for folks tonight to have this discussion and to do these readings. You know, thank you very much for being here tonight. I certainly appreciate you joining. And you know, if you're looking for more readings, I'm sure that, you know, as soon as I read the readings that I didn't read for tonight, I'm sure I can come up with other readings that would be useful as well if anyone is interested.
Well, if everyone would please join me, as always, with giving Dr. Schambra a round of applause, and thank you so much for leading an interesting conversation. We have one more week left, so please make sure to do the readings, and hopefully we'll have a great final conversation. I'm looking forward to it. The next session is on foreign policy with John Hillen. Also a fascinating conversation I'm sure will ensue. So again, Dr. Schambra, thank you so much for joining us and leading this. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Okay, thank you.